Pacific Ocean, December 1941. The flames of World War spread across the vast blue expanse of the ocean. Following the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan had dealt a devastating blow to the United States Pacific Fleet, temporarily crippling American naval power and bringing a rising superpower to its knees. The eyes of the world were fixated on the giant battleships, massive aircraft carriers, and legendary aerial dogfights that echoed across the skies of the South Pacific. Yet, beneath the turbulent waves in the dark, silent depths of the CA, far more lethal, systemic campaign was quietly taking shape. This was the opening chapter of the Silent Blockade, a relentless, cold, and calculated campaign waged by U.S. Navy submarines to systematically destroy 55% of Japan's entire merchant fleet, severing the economic arteries of an empire and forcing a proud military superpower to starve into surrender. To understand the sheer magnitude and tragic vulnerability of the Japanese Empire during World War II, one must first look at its basic geographic reality. Japan is an isolated island nation with severely limited natural resources. In the 1940s, the vital raw materials required to feed and sustain the massive Japanese war machine, rubber, iron, or bauxite, nickel, copper, and food supplies were practically non-existent on the home islands. Over 90% of these essential industrial materials had to be imported from abroad. Japan's rapid, aggressive military expansion across Southeast Asia and the Pacific in late 1941 and early 1942 was driven almost entirely by the desperate need to secure these resource-rich territories. They conquered the Dutch East Indies for crude oil, Malaya for rubber and tin, the Philippines for mineral ores, and Indochina for agricultural production. However, conquering those resource-rich lands was only half of the strategic equation. Bringing those raw materials back home across thousands of miles of open ocean required a massive, continuous fleet of merchant freighters, cargo ships, and tankers, known collectively in Japan as Maru ships. Without these civilian freighters running non-stop maritime supply lines, Japanese factories would quickly grind to a halt. Warplanes would run out of aviation fuel, military factories would lack metal, and both soldiers and civilians would face total starvation. The merchant fleet was the literal bloodstream of the Japanese Empire. If that bloodstream stopped flowing, the entire imperial war effort would collapse from within, just hours after the devastating news of the Pearl Harbor attack reached Washington. Admiral Harold Stark, the Chief of Naval Operations, dispatched a historic and uncompromising order to all fleet commanders: execute unrestricted air and submarine warfare against Japan in an instant. All traditional international laws, cruiser rules, and prize protocols of naval warfare were cast aside. Any vessel flying the flag of the Japanese Empire, whether a heavily armed heavy cruiser or a completely defenseless wooden freighter carrying bags of rice, was marked for immediate, unannounced destruction by torpedo. Despite the total strategic freedom granted by Washington, the opening 2 years of the submarine war turned out to be an agonizing, tragic nightmare for the American Silent Service. Throughout 1942 and deep into 1943, American submariners found themselves battling an insidious, infuriating internal enemy, the notoriously defective Mark 14 torpedo. In what became one of the most disgraceful engineering and bureaucratic failures in American military history, these torpedoes failed at almost every critical moment. Submarine captains would execute brilliant, dangerous tactical maneuvers to slip past enemy escorts, get within a few hundred yards of a massive Japanese freighter, fire a perfect spread of torpedoes, and then watch in absolute despair as the weapons failed to function. The Mark 14 torpedo suffered from three distinct, catastrophic design defects. First, its depth control mechanism was horribly calibrated, causing the torpedoes to run up to 10 feet deeper than set and pass completely beneath the hulls of target ships without touching them. Second, its sensitive magnetic exploder, designed to detonate the warhead directly underneath a ship's keel, frequently exploded prematurely hundreds of yards before reaching the target, alerting enemy warships to the submarine's location. Third, even when the magnetic exploder was disabled and the torpedo struck a Japanese ship directly at a perfect 90-degree angle, the mechanical contact detonator was so weakly designed that it would shatter upon impact without setting off the main warhead. Submarine commanders were forced to watch helplessly as heavily loaded Japanese merchant ships sailed away completely unharmed. Captain Dudley "Mush" Morton, the legendary commander of the USS Wahoo, famously lamented that while American submarines were engineering marvels and their crews were willing to lay down their lives, they were essentially being sent into combat armed with useless paper spit. Making matters vastly worse, the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington stubbornly denied that their prized weapon was defective. Bureaucratic generals and engineers blamed the lack of sinkings on improper maintenance by crew members or poor aiming by the submarine captains. This arrogant denial cost countless American lives, prolonged the war, and allowed the Japanese merchant fleet to operate with relative impunity during the crucial early years of the conflict. The tide finally turned in late 1943, when Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, known to his submariners as Uncle Charlie, assumed full command of the Pacific submarine fleet, refusing to tolerate the excuses coming out of Washington. Lockwood ordered his own unauthorized, rigorous field tests off the coast of Hawaii by firing live torpedoes through custom-built fishing nets and against sheer sea cliffs. He conclusively proved to the High Command that the Mark 14 was a total disaster. Lockwood personally oversaw the redesign of the firing pins, disabled the faulty magnetic and forced the Navy to supply reliable contact detonators when fully functional. Reliable torpedoes finally reached the frontline fleet in late 1943. The balance of power across the Pacific Ocean shifted instantly. With dependable weapons loaded into their torpedo tubes, the U.S. Navy submarine force unleashed a terrifyingly efficient strategy. Advanced Gakau-class and Bella-class submarines began patrolling the deep trade routes of the Pacific. These modern submarines could stay at sea for months at a time, possessed impressive range, and were equipped with state-of-the-art radar technology, while the Imperial Japanese Navy severely lagged behind in radar development. American submarines used surface search radar to track Japanese shipping convoys through pitch-black nights, dense fog, and heavy storms, launching devastating torpedo attacks before the Japanese lookouts ever realized they were being hunted. Japan had naively assumed that organizing its merchant ships into small convoys guarded by minor escort vessels would protect its supply lines. Instead, aggressive American captains developed bold new tactics. Captains like Richard O'Kane of the USS Thames would fearlessly surface their submarines inside the very center of a Japanese convoy under cover of dark, sinking multiple large freighters and tankers in a matter of minutes. Underpinning this entire offensive was the brilliant work of American codebreakers under the Ultra Intelligence Program, who had cracked the Japanese naval and merchant shipping codes. Submarine captains were no longer searching aimlessly over millions of square miles of open ocean. They were given exact coordinates, speeds, and schedules of incoming Japanese convoys, transforming the blockade into a mathematically calculated execution of Japan's economic lifeline. By early 1944, the silent blockade had escalated into an inescapable war of attrition. Adapting the Wolfpack tactics pioneered by German U-boats, the U.S. Navy organized its Pacific submarines into coordinated strike teams, operating in groups of three bearing nicknames like Blair's Dedicated Hunters and Donk's Devils. These packs swept key sea lanes. When one submarine detected a convoy via radar, it radioed the target's speed and heading, allowing all three vessels to converge and strike simultaneously from multiple angles. The Pacific Ocean rapidly transformed into an inescapable graveyard for Japanese shipping. The most catastrophic blow was the systematic destruction of Japan's oil tanker fleet. Lacking domestic energy reserves, Japan depended entirely on tankers returning from the occupied oil fields of Sumatra, Java, and Borneo. American commanders made oil tankers high-priority targets. By mid-1944, millions of barrels of crude oil and aviation fuel were burning at sea rather than reaching Japanese refineries. The strategic fallout was immediate and fatal. Major warships of the Imperial Japanese Navy, including the massive battleships Yamato and Musashi, sat immobilized at their moorings due to a lack of fuel. Aviation fuel shortages crippled flight training, forcing novice pilots into battle with as little as 20 to 30 hours of flight experience, making them easy targets for seasoned Allied aviators over the Philippines and Okinawa. The blockade halted the movement of all raw materials. Steel mills in Kyushu ran out of imported iron ore, while aircraft plants stalled without bauxite for aluminum. On the home front, civilians faced severe rationing and starvation as grain shipments from occupied China, Korea, and Formosa were intercepted and sunk simultaneously. Millions of Japanese soldiers stationed across isolated Pacific Island garrisons were cut off, deprived of food, medical supplies, and ammunition. These forces were bypassed by General Douglas MacArthur's island-hopping campaign. Far more Japanese troops perished from starvation and malaria than from direct combat, abandoned by an empire that could no longer resupply them. Despite this crisis, Japan's anti-submarine warfare (ASW) response was rigid and inadequate. Escort vessels lacked modern sonar, surface radar, and effective weapons. Crucially, Japanese naval intelligence suffered from a fatal misconception. They believed U.S. submarines could not dive deeper than 100 to 150 feet without catastrophic hull failure. Consequently, Japanese crews set depth charges to detonate at shallow levels. American captains routinely dived to 300, 400, or 500 feet, riding out the explosions unharmed far above. It took Japanese command over 2 years to realize this mistake, by which time the bulk of their merchant fleet was destroyed. By late 1944, sailing under the flag of the rising sun was a virtual suicide mission. As American submarines pressed into coastal waters like the East China, South China, and Yellow Seas, maritime trade collapsed entirely. Major ports like Kobe, Yokohama, Osaka, and Nagasaki fell silent, their channels choked with wrecked vessels. Surviving merchant ships were forced to hug the shallow coastline at night in desperate, fruitless attempts to avoid radar detection. When World War II ended in August 1945, the statistical record of the American submarine force was staggering, accounting for less than 2% of total U.S. Navy personnel and assets. Submarines sank 55% of all Japanese merchant ship losses, over 1,300 vessels, totaling more than 5 million gross tons. Additionally, submarines destroyed over 30% of the Imperial Japanese Navy's combat ships, including 8 aircraft carriers, 1 battleship, and over 11 heavy cruisers. The silent blockade crippled Japan's capacity to wage war long before the atomic bombs were dropped or a mainland invasion was launched. By summer 1945, Japan suffered from widespread malnutrition, industrial collapse, and power grid failures. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that even without atomic strikes or an amphibious landing, Japan's economic paralysis from the naval blockade made unconditional surrender inevitable within months. Victory was forged in the dark, cramped steel hulls of American submarines, executing one of the most decisive campaigns of strategic attrition in naval history.